Outstanding. Well, look, I know we have a very intense program over the next 2 days, and our time together this morning is limited. So I'm going to do everything I can to be brief. As Henry VIII said to each of his wives, I won't keep you long. Ladies and gentlemen, you have invited a journalist to speak to you here this morning. And if you have a right to expect anything from a journalist, and frankly I would counsel you not to expect very much, but if you have a right to expect anything, it is that a journalist should always give her or his facts right. So let us begin this morning with a fact. Okay, not a hunch, not a theory, not an anecdotal impression, not a gut level instinct, but a hardcore, take it to the bank, hang your hat on it, empirical fact. And that fact is, as of today, it's February 25th, is it not? February 25th, 2016. Pope Francis is by far the most popular spiritual figure on the planet and one of the most popular figures of any kind. Now, I could demonstrate the facticity of that claim to you in a variety of different ways. For example, we could start with his Twitter following. Do you all know that Pope Francis is coming up on the 30 million mark in terms of the combined following for his 9 Twitter accounts? This now makes him by far the most followed spiritual figure in the Twitter universe, easily surpassing the Dalai Lama, for example. Though not yet the most followed human being in absolute. Do you all know, as of today, who the most followed person on Twitter is? Got a guess? Justin Bieber is what I usually get, but bam, not quite. As of today, the most followed figure on Twitter is Katy Perry. Rounding out the top 5 are, in order, Justin Bieber, Barack Obama, Taylor Swift, and Lady Gaga. And yes, ladies and gentlemen, surely the apocalypse cannot be far behind. But you know, give the Pope a break. He's only been on Twitter 3 years. Those folks have been around longer. If you want another demonstration of his mass appeal, we can talk about his poll numbers. Again, it is a fact, not a theory, a fact, that in every corner of the world where public opinion can be scientifically measured, this Pope has poll numbers that politicians and celebrities would sacrifice their children to pagan gods to obtain. Okay, think about this. After Pope Francis's trip to the United States last September, there was a Gallup USA Today poll which found that overall the Pope had an 80% approval rating in America among Americans generally, and a 92% approval rating among American Catholics. Now, think about that number for a moment, 92%, and put it in the context of what I presume most of you know about how badly divided the American Catholic Church is on virtually everything. I mean, the truth is, if we had a representative sample of 100 American Catholics in this room, I doubt you could get 92 of them to agree that today is Thursday. Okay, on the left, there would be some crowd that suspected a hierarchical plot to control our sense of time. And on the right, you would find a couple of grumpy guys who think we should still be using the Julian calendar. Okay, that's just the practical reality of it. And in that context, the fact that the Pope has a 92% approval rating is nothing short of miraculous. And frankly, when we get around to the beatification and canonization of Jorge Mario Bergoglio, I think this could count as the first miracle. Okay? Or we could talk about all the magazine covers he's been on. I mean, I presume you know he's been Times Person of the Year. I mean, for God's sakes, folks, he was on the cover of Rolling Stone magazine. Okay? I mean, that's how you know you arrived. But do you know what the first publication in the world to declare him its Person of the Year was? It actually wasn't Time. It was the Italian edition of Vanity Fair. I mean, Vanity Fair, this is not exactly a house organ of the Catholic Church. Okay, 3 months into the game, they declared Pope Francis their Person of the Year. And by the way, including a bit of insight from that well-known Vatican expert, Elton John, who described Pope Francis as, quote, a miracle of humility in an era of vanity. Miracle of humility in an era of vanity. It's a great line. I'm waiting for the world to forget that Elton John said it so I can steal it. You know, we could go on and on, you know, multiplying examples of this Pope's popularity, but I trust the point he's made. And of course, it is fun to speculate and fun to sort of soak in the celebrity around Francis. But the real question is, what's beneath that celebrity? That is this just sort of a pop culture phenomenon, or is the world responding to something in Francis that is actually profoundly important and authentic and badly needed in our time? And I would suggest the answer to that question is yes. Now, of course, that begs the issue, what is it that they are responding to? And I'm going to try to lay it out for you. I begin with this assumption. There is a bizarre media phenomenon, and I don't know if you've noticed this, that sometimes the more cultural noise there is about a public figure, the less we actually know about it. Right? Because you have to separate the wheat from the chaff, and there are so many competing reconstructions and interpretations, it can be hard to know who the real person beneath the firmament actually is. So what I'm going to do is give you 3 pillars to understanding who Francis is and what he is about. And I will submit to you 2 things in advance. 1, if you understand these 3 things about Pope Francis, you will understand 90% of everything that he says and does. The second thing I will submit to you, and this is a bit of a spoiler alert, but what I'm about to describe to you are not only the keys to understanding the person of Pope Francis, they are also, in many ways, a mission statement for Catholic social services. Okay, so the takeaway that you all should absorb from this morning is that in Pope Francis, what you have in effect is a Magna Carta for Catholic social services in flesh and bone. A Magna Carta in flesh and bone. Okay? So the 3 pillars of Francis's identity, priorities, outlook I want to give you are, I'll tick them off and then unpack each. 1, a passion for the peripheries. A passion for the peripheries, both the geographic and existential peripheries of the world. 2, a deeply missionary concept of church. Deeply missionary concept of church. And 3, mercy as the cornerstone spiritual message that the world needs to hear from the church at this moment in time. Okay? So passion for the peripheries, missionary concept of church, and mercy. Let's begin with a passion for the peripheries. We all know that popes often speak in their gestures just as much as they do with their words. Okay? And one category, one especially eloquent category of Pope Francis's gestures, I think, is composed of his tricks. I have often said that if you want to understand Pope Francis's view of the world, you do not need a spokesman, you do not need a spin doctor, all you need is his travel agent, okay? Because it will explain everything that you need to know. It is, I think, the farthest thing from an accident that Francis's first trip outside of Rome on June 8, 2013, was to the island of Lampedusa. I know you all know what Lampedusa is, the island in the southern Mediterranean that is a primary point of arrival for impoverished migrants and refugees, generally from the Middle East and Africa, who are trying to make their way to Europe. The Pope went there on that day to lay a wreath in the sea, commemorating the 20,000 people who are believed to have lost their lives in the last 2 decades alone, trying to make that very dangerous crossing over the Mediterranean. And it was the first time that he rolled out what has since become one of the standard rhetorical tropes of his papacy, which is the contrast between what he calls a throwaway culture, in which whole categories of humanity are regarded as essentially disposable, versus what he describes as a culture of encounter. And I know that word encounter to Anglo-Saxon ears may not have much pop and sizzle to it, but in a Latin context, encounter is everything. It's about replacing this throwaway culture with a human environment in which people care for one another, not because of their utility to them, but because of their inherent dignity and worth. Okay? It is no accident that Pope Francis traveled to the Middle East, to Eastern Europe, to Asia, and to Latin America before he went any place in the so-called First World. And to date, by the way, he has only made one trip in Western Europe. It was a day trip to Strasbourg to address the European Parliament. He still has not made a state visit anywhere in Western Europe. He's made one visit to what we would recognize as the developed world in the United States. These are not accidents. Okay? I mean, in effect, ladies and gentlemen, this is the gospel principle of the last shall be first as an actual, honest-to-God program of governance. Okay? You can also see this passion for the peripheries in the way Pope Francis makes cardinals. Have you noticed that it is his tendency to bypass the traditional centers of power when he wants to create new cardinals. And by the way, as a footnote, that is the appropriate ecclesiastical verb. We say the Pope creates cardinals, which leads to the cynical old Roman joke that only God and the Pope can make something out of nothing. In any event, when the Pope creates cardinals, he does not typically bestow these red hats on the traditional places. In Italy today, for example, it has escaped no one's attention that Turin and Venice do not have cardinals, but Agrigento in Sicily does, and Ancona does. In Haiti, when he decided to create the first ever cardinal in Haiti, he didn't give it to Port-au-Prince. He went to the small diocese of Lake Cayenne. Looking around the globe, it is part of his program to try to lift up cardinals in places that have never had them. I mean, in the last consistory, you all, I guess, probably knew that Tonga was a country, but I didn't until it suddenly got a cardinal. And by the way, you know what actually has a king and queen? I mean, this is a place that has a population of 100,000. It's like the city of Indianapolis. But the king and queen of Indianapolis were there at the consistory. It was fantastic. Okay, these are not accidents, and these aren't just faux PR gestures. This is about a Pope who is leading us to embrace the marginalized, the forgotten, the isolated, the overlooked of the earth. Okay, so that's thing number one to understand about Francis: the passion for the periphery. Okay. Two, it's a deeply missionary concept of church. Ladies and gentlemen, I have been covering popes for about 20 years now. Okay, I've covered three of them. I've covered John Paul II, Benedict XVI, and now Francis. And if I have one ironclad moral certainty on the back of those 20 years of experience about the papacy, it is that being pope in our time is an impossible job. It's almost metaphysically impossible. Okay, think about what we want popes to be. And I don't mean the description of the office in the catechism or in the code. I mean popularly, out in the street. Okay, what do people expect from popes? We want them to be intellectual giants, conversant with all the great currents in the culture. We want them to be political titans, able to wave a magic wand and make the world's problems disappear. We want them to be media rock stars. We want them to be Fortune 500 CEOs running a complex religious multinational. And, of course, we want them to be living saints. Okay? Now, any one of those things is hard to do as a life's work. I mean, you roll it up all into one ball. It is a crushing burden. And if you don't believe me, okay, go back and look at pictures of Karol Wojtyła of Krakow in October 1978 when he was elected to the papacy. And then look at images of him from the end in April 2005. It wasn't just the age, and it wasn't just the Parkinson's. It was the bone-crushing nature of this impossible burden. Now, so what that means in practice is that every pope has to pick and choose. No pope can do all of that perfectly. Okay? So the question is, when Francis has to pick and choose aspects of the job that are most important to him, where does he go? I guarantee that when Pope Francis gets out of bed in the morning, he does not fundamentally think of himself as an administrator or a manager, even though managerial reform of the Church, beginning in the Vatican and radiating out, is an important part of the electoral mandate he was handed in March 2013, and he knows it's important. But it's not his top priority. I guarantee you, when he gets out of bed in the morning, he does not fundamentally think of himself as an intellectual, even though he's a very bright man. He does not aspire to be the Church's theologian-in-chief. You know, that was Benedict XVI. That's where his energy went. That's not Francis. Okay? Francis fundamentally thinks of himself as a missionary. Remember that when his priestly vocation was born, his original aspiration was to be Argentina's answer to Matteo Ricci and St. Francis Xavier. You know, his original dream was of being a missionary in China. And of course, life did not have that in store for him, but the embers of that missionary vocation continue to smolder. They burn in the man's heart. So he is, by every instinct, every fiber of his being, he is a missionary, and he wants to preside over a missionary church. This is why one of his standard sound bites, the kind of thing he repeats over and over, has become this invitation. But it's more than an invitation. It's a kind of heartfelt plea. It's a cri de coeur from Francis. Is for the church to get out of the sacristy and into the street. okay, out of the sacristy and into the street. It is, at its core, a missionary appeal. Okay? The most important document, if you want to read a document that gives you the kind of hermeneutical key to unlocking Francis's heart and mind, it really isn't Evangelium Gaudium, as sparkling a text as that is. It's really not Laudato Si, as complex and thoughtful as that is. The key text, the base text for understanding Francis, is the 2007 document of the Latin American bishops, which they put together in Aparecida, the Marian Shrine, the famed Marian Shrine in Aparecida, a text for which Jorge Mario Bergoglio of Buenos Aires was the lead author and chief editor. And it has at its core a call for a great continental mission. That is, this notion that the church must break out, must shake off, must get past this reliance on structure and institutional prowess, and must realize that our cash value, so to speak, in the era in which we live, is not inside the sanctuary, it's not inside magnificent buildings, it's out in the street meeting people where they live. That is the key to understanding this Pope. And as a missionary, therefore, as a missionary, there is an almost preternatural sort of instinct of daring in this pontiff. Okay? Now, I would not use the word reckless, but there certainly is, we'll put it to you this way, if for Francis it is ever a choice between caution and daring, daring is going to win every day of the week and twice on Sunday. Okay? And so there is an invitation, I think, to all of us implied in that to be daring ourselves, to be bold, to take risks, to move into uncharted waters. As John Paul II used to say, duc in altum, set off into the deep. And in his own way, Francis would very much echo that. Okay? So that's the second point, this missionary conception of what the church is all about. Missionary as opposed to institutional, structural, political. Okay? Third, mercy as the spiritual Rosetta Stone for understanding what this Pope is about. Mercy, there's a great deal we can say about this. Mercy, ladies and gentlemen, is quite literally this Pope's motto. Okay? His motto as Pope, which is the same motto he had as the Archbishop of Buenos Aires, is a Latin phrase. It comes from a homily of the Venerable Bede about the gospel scene of the Paul of Matthew. And the line is, miserando atque elegendo. Miserando atque elegendo, which is a little hard to bring into English, but basically what it means is choosing through the eyes of mercy. Okay? Making decisions on the basis of mercy. Okay? We all know that we are living in the middle of a special Jubilee Holy Year of Mercy called by Pope Francis, which clearly flows from this invitation, this emphasis, this accent on mercy. What you may not know is that his very first Sunday homily as Pope, which he chose to give not in the magnificence of St. Peter's Basilica, but in St. Anne's, which is the working parish church of the Vatican. It's where the worker bees, the guys who scrub the floors and open the mail and fix the lights and so forth, go to worship on Sundays. And he walked up to the ambo with no notes, utterly extemporaneously, said, I hope the theologians in this room will forgive me, but in my opinion, the strongest message of the Lord is mercy. Okay? The strongest message of the Lord is mercy. One of the places you can see this passion for mercy percolating in an especially palpable fashion in Pope Francis is his deep commitment to the sacrament of confession. You may know, for example, that during the Good Friday penitential service in the Vatican now, he hears confessions himself, which popes have done before. But what he has added is that before he hears confessions, he confesses himself. He goes to one of the priest confessors in the Basilica and receives the sacrament himself before he administers it. He has also added this, it's now become a standard part of the itinerary for his parish visits. I presume most people here know that a pope is also the Bishop of Rome, right? He's the bishop of the local diocese in Rome. And one of the ways popes try to express that is by getting around and making parish visits. There are 273 working parishes in Rome. No pope can get to all of them, but they try to get to as many as they possibly can. Francis made his first parish visit in May of 2013, May of 2013. He went out to Saints Elizabeth and Zechariah Parish, which is in the Porta Pia neighborhood of Rome. It's up on the northern part of town, kind of a working class neighborhood. And what happened was, I happen to know the pastor there. It's a Romanian immigrant by the name of Vaioni Ambris. Everybody calls him Padre Ben, okay? So I called him up, and I said, listen, Padre Ben, do you mind if I come out and hang out? I'd like to kind of, see the show. And he said, sure. So the plan was, the Pope was supposed to get there at 10:30, okay, in the morning. So at 9:30, I'm sitting in Padre Ben's office. We're having coffee, shooting the breeze. And all of a sudden, we start hearing the thump, thump, thump of a helicopter, okay, in the distance. And at first, we're thinking, well, this is the Carabinieri, right? That's the Italian military police doing, like, security flyover, okay? But that thump, thump, thump gets louder and louder. And finally, we realized it was the papal helicopter. The guy was showing up, like, 45 minutes ahead of schedule. So, after I run to grab the defibrillator to restart Father Ben's heart, he sprinted out to the parking lot where they had set up this, like, makeshift helipad, right? And the papal chopper lands in Bergoglio. Pope Francis pops out, and he says, hey, listen, sorry for the early start, but in addition to saying Mass and chatting with the people and all of that, I would also like to hear some confessions. Now, bear in mind, this was not part of the program, right? So Father Ben ran and grabbed 8 people, basically completely at random, and said, you are going to confess. And it was so cute, because I'm standing there watching this, and the one guy looks up at Father Ben and says, well, Father, that's very sweet, but, I've been waiting here for like 3 hours. I don't want to lose my spot in line to see the Pope. To which he has to say, oh, trust me, you're going to see the Pope. So, he brings these 8 people into the church and lines them up in front of the confessional, and one by one, Pope Francis hears their sins and administers God's forgiveness. Now, catch the point. In part, this was just about him trying to be a good Bishop of Rome and doing his pastoral duty. But if you want an insight into Pope Francis that you dare never forget, okay, a 5-star banner headline, full living color thing to always bear in mind about this Pope. It is this: beneath that humble, simple, pastoral exterior, which is all real, by the way, but beneath that lies the mind of a brilliant Jesuit politician. Okay? There are no accidents. There are no uncalculated moves. This is not evening at the Improv with Pope Francis. Okay? In this case, he wanted the world to see the Pope making a point of celebrating the Church's premier rite of mercy. On the papal plane in July 2013, when Pope Francis was returning from Brazil, and he did the first of what have now become these legendary in-flight press conferences that he does. And by the way, ladies and gentlemen, I travel with popes all the time. I will tell you, in many ways, it is a dismal experience. We are stuck back in steerage, so the seats are uncomfortable, the food is generally mediocre, but with Pope Francis, I will give it this: the in-flight entertainment is spectacular. Okay? So in that July 2013 press conference, he said something that I think, with the benefit of hindsight, has become the mission statement of this papacy. We asked him a question about divorced and civilly remarried Catholics, which of course is one of the hot-button issues at his synods of bishops on the family, and he gave us an answer. But implied in that answer, there is a paragraph that you should really look up. I think it ought to be printed on T-shirts somewhere, in which the Pope says, I believe that we are living in a kairos of mercy. We are living in a kairos of mercy, using that New Testament term that means a privileged moment in God's plan of salvation. This is a Pope, ladies and gentlemen, who believes the providential logic for his election. Okay, the reason the Holy Spirit placed him on the throne of Peter was to lift up, dust off, and make resplendent once again the Church's message of mercy. Now look, he is a savvy Christian pastor. He understands that he has a responsibility to do 2 things with regard to a fallen world. He must pronounce both God's judgment and God's mercy. One without the other would be a falsification of the Christian message. But I think his calculation is that the world has heard our judgment with crystal clarity, and now it is time for them to hear and to see and to feel and to taste and even to smell our mercy. If you ask me, and I realize no one in this room has asked, but I am legendary for answering questions I have never been asked, so here we go. If you ask me, how will Pope Francis be remembered? Okay, I would predict to you that it's not progressive, revolutionary, maverick reformer, Pope of the people, any of that stuff. I believe that in the long run of history, we will remember Francis as the Pope of mercy. The Pope of mercy. And of course, that idea did not originate with him. He is hardly the first figure in the Christian tradition to talk about mercy. It is a concept that goes all the way back to the very beginning. The death of God on the cross to redeem the world was the supreme act of mercy. Okay? But I believe he will be the Pope who will be remembered as the one who made that message hearable, who made that message sealable, who made that message feelable in his own time. Okay? Again, you remember these three things about Francis: passion for the periphery, a deeply missionary concept of the church, and this emphasis on mercy. You will understand the man, and you will also understand why I tell you he is the Magna Carta in flesh and bone for the work of Catholic social services. Okay. I want to leave you with one final thought. This program of governance I just described to you is, I think we could all agree, a fairly ambitious one. It is easy to talk about mercy. It is easy to extol the peripheries. It is easy to pledge oneself to mission as a kind of life's blood. What is difficult, of course, is to translate that into practice. And I know in many ways that's what these 2 days are all about for you, is figuring out how that job description, that lofty, inspiring vision of what the church can be, what that means in the concrete details of what you do day in and day out. Okay? Now, to make that a success, you are going to need many qualities of heart and mind. You are going to need imagination. You are going to need perseverance. You are going to need patience. You are going to need a dialogic spirit. You're going to need all kinds of things. But I want to guarantee you one quality that has to be in the mix. One quality without which we cannot succeed in this endeavor. And that quality is a lively sense of humor. Because I guarantee you, ladies and gentlemen, if you cannot occasionally laugh at the challenges that stand before you, laugh at the occasional surreal nature of the situations in which you find yourselves, that is a prescription for perpetual heartburn, and that way madness lies. Okay? Now, the good news that I want to leave you with is that you can find this lively sense of humor in the church, even in the most wildly improbable places. And I will tell you one last story to drive that point home, and then I will be done. Back in April 2005, when Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger was elected to the papacy as Benedict XVI, as you heard in the introduction, I did one of these Insta-books about the new Pope, okay, which is called The Rise of Benedict. And in the Vatican press corps, there is this tradition that when one of us does a book about the Pope, we inscribe a copy, to the Holy Father, and then we give it either to his priest secretary or to his spokesman or somebody in his inner circle, right? Okay. To be honest with you, it had never occurred to me for a moment that popes would actually read these books. I mean, in my mind's eye, I had envisioned a box in the basement of the Apostolic Palace, right, where they all get tossed in and get their dust. So anyway, Benedict is elected in April. I wrote the book in May. It comes out June 1st. I dutifully inscribed a copy, and I gave it to Joaquin Navarro-Bulls, who at the time was still the Pope's portavoce, spokesman. And then I just forgot it. And I'll flash forward to August of 2005. My wife and I are back in the States. We're visiting, well, at the time she would have been, I guess, my 93-year-old grandma. Who lived out where I grew up, which is in rural western Kansas. To be precise, candidate for the worst place name in America, because there is no hill, and there sure as hell is no city. I mean, we're talking about like 600 people on a good day. Okay? The only time, basically, anybody ever visits Hill City is during the fall, because that's pheasant hunting season. Do you know what a pheasant is? It's a little game bird, kind of like a turkey. Okay? I mean, honest to God, folks, I have traveled the world fairly widely, and I have stayed in some pretty funky lodges on God's green earth. But just to give you a sense of the cultural milieu in Hill City, America, there is one 11-room motel. And it is the only place on earth I have ever stayed where there is a laminated sign in the bathroom that reads, "Please do not gut your birds in the sink." The first time I took my wife there, she asked me, "Is this some kind of weird sexual thing?" No. Face value stuff. Anyway, so there we are in Hill City, America. Okay? And my cell phone goes off. And it's Joaquin Navarro-Valls on the other end of the line. And Navarro-Valls says to me, "Hey, John, I wanted you to know that I'm with the Holy Father. Benedict was vacationing at that point up in northern Italy, Velletro, staying in a Salesian chalet. Oh, and by the way, if you want some profitable tip from today, something you can actually use, here it is. I have noticed that anywhere in the world a Pope goes, no matter how chic or exclusive or whatever, the Salesians always seem to have a gorgeous chalet there. So, my tip is that if you have Salesian friends, try to get in on their timeshare deals. I'm telling you. Okay? News you can use. Anyway, so he says, "I'm with the Holy Father in Velletro, and I wanted you to know he came down to breakfast this morning with your book in his hands, and he had a message that he asked me to pass on." Okay, I don't know about you, but if you've just been told the Pope has a personal reaction to something you've written about him, I would want to make sure that your tray table is in a full upright and locked position. Because, the skies make it a little bumpy. But I said, "No, of course, Vicky, that's great. That's the message." Okay. Now, to understand this, you have to know that my book was divided into thirds. Okay? So the first part was the final days of John Paul II. The middle part was the inside story of how Cardinal Ratzinger had been elected as Benedict. And then the third was sort of my projections for where things would go. Okay? So, Joaquin says, "The Holy Father's message is the following. Please thank Herr Dr. Allen for having written this book, particularly the last part about the future of my papacy, because it has saved me the trouble of thinking about it for myself." I like to think he was kidding. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, I would suggest that on this score, as on so many others, we take our cue from the Holy Father. If we can take an unblinking, utterly realistic look at the depth of the challenges that a broken, bruised, and hurting world sets before us, the seeming impossibility of administering the medicine of mercy in a culture and a time where mercy seems to be in an increasingly short supply, if we can look at all of that with eyes wide open, but we can do it with a twinkle in our eye rather than with despair in our heart or bile in our spleens, that, I would suggest to you, is a winning strategy for Catholic social services in the early 21st century. Thank you. God bless you. God bless Catholic social services.